Hey guys, I got something really cool in the mail today, and I was hoping I could show you it. Now, with this photograph, there's gonna come a little bit of a history lesson. I hope that you'll stick around and actually listen, because there's a lot of really cool information that I'm trying to impart in this message. Now, you might know more than me about this topic, and if you do, I really do encourage you to let me know, because I am a student of history, and that's going to be a lifelong seat in the Academy of History. So what I picked up was this 1939 magazine clip featuring a Lucky Strike cigarette advertisement. Now, one of the coolest things about this cigarette advertisement is that this was made by Edward Bernays, the nephew to Sigmund Freud, during his tenure at American Tobacco Company working for Lucky Strike cigarettes. Much like Don Draper in Mad Men, Edward Bernays was a former military PSYOPs propaganda artist whose now his job was to work for corporate America and to make sure that the intended targets are looking at the intended advertisements and making all of their informed business purchases off of little clips like this. So let's set the historical backdrop. It's the 1930s. The First Great War has come and gone. And now women have been in the workplace, and now they're competing against men for the very same jobs that they've been doing for years. Women are getting paid less, they're getting discriminated against, they're being told that they can't be in the workplace. And at the time, only 6% of women were smoking cigarettes in the entirety of the United States. The reason why this is important is that's why Edward Bernays was hired. How do we get cigarette numbers up? Now, Edward Bernays is the nephew to Sigmund Freud. So he got a bunch of teaching about how to affect the subconscious mind with subliminal intention, subliminal advertising, and all of that from his uncle. Edward Bernays actually paid his uncle for the rights to his work so that he could weaponize the subconscious mind that his uncle had discovered for American capitalist enterprise. So step one, how do we get women to smoke? Well, we have to look at what women want. And what women want aren't cigarettes. At the time, it's equality. Bernays came up with the idea, after talking to several of his colleagues, that what women are after is they just want to be respected in the workplace and viewed as equals. So the idea was, in order for you as a woman to be seen as an equal to a man, you, they postulated, need to take on more masculine attributes in the workplace so they'll actually see you as one of them. So, in the Great War, there were two types of cigarettes produced. There were unfiltered cigarettes, and then there were premium cigarettes with a filter. Now, filtered cigarettes were almost exclusively produced by Lucky Strike cigarettes for men going over the trenches in the First World War. And enlisted men got little unfiltered stogie-type cigarettes, and that's what they smoked. So if you were an officer, you wanted to award one of your enlisted men for, hey, you did a good job, have some smokes. Here's a Lucky Strike, kid. You know, oh, geez, thanks. I like this cherry, and I'm not on the line. Don't want to get killed by any of them Kraut snipers. That's the vibe. So women smoking these Lucky Strike cigarettes, there was much like wearing a military uniform allows you to borrow the prestige and the authority of the army while you're wearing the uniform, a Lucky Strike cigarette was almost seen exclusively as the gentleman's choice for the higher quality man, for the officers. See my point? Edward Bernays created that image, and moreover wanted America to accept that image, because to him, this would boost cigarette sales. But like every great thing that happens in America, the idea alone is not going to sell it. You need a galvanizing moment. You need a moment that captures the eyeballs. Because ideas, you can toss them around all day. But until something happens in the news that gets it in front of everybody's face, no one's going to bite. So what Mr. Bernays did was he went to all of the local colleges and universities, and he gathered all of the women's suffrage and feminist leaders and all the activists, and he pulled them into one conference. And he basically relayed the idea that I just spoke to you. If you want equality, you need to make yourself equal to a man and stop expecting a man to view you as equal. And what would make a man view you as a man? then denying all of the previous stigmatas about smoking a cigarette as a lady. Women viewed women who smoked as gross, uncouth, unladylike, lacking manners. They smelled bad. They smelled like smoke and tar, and And men, they viewed women who smoked in the exact opposite light. They're too masculine. They're not ladylike. It's not what they expected. And that is the idea that Bernays wanted to implant on all of the people that he gathered into his lectures. After a little bit of time about talking about who or what or where they were supposed to feel about women coming into the workplace, the main idea was this. If you wanted a man to view you as anything, as more than a woman, you needed to make yourself masculine. And you could do that by just buying your own Lucky Strike cigarettes. I believe the psychologist even said it represented their own phallus, that the cigarette itself was a woman creating their own penis, which, in the 1930s, it probably felt like revolutionary science. They had just come up with the Oedipus complex a decade before, so they're on some good shit back then. Anyways, Mr. Bernays, to take it one step further, to create this galvanizing moment, you should find all of the data in this if you ever read his book, Propaganda, or you can watch the documentary on YouTube, Century of the Self. It's Edward Bernays in his own documentary talking about all this stuff. It's a wonderful, eye-opening experience. I really recommend it. So he gathers up all these women, presses the information. They go out and they start pumping all the information into the university students, telling all the younger generation, the more hip crowd that's going to be fighting for their equality in the next 20, 30 years. Because in the 1930s, if you're 18 to 22 years old and you're in college, well, in the 1950s and 60s, you're going to be 50, 60 years old, 40, 50 years old, and you're going to be the one that's really controlling the country at that point, just the way things progress. So, what happens next? Edward Bernays hires a bunch of beautiful models, gorgeous, gorgeous models, and they bring all of their boyfriends, husbands, you name it, to a women's rally where they're protesting equality, and they're trying to bring more equality to women and bring up more women's workers' rights, etc. Bernays also hired his journalists and news crews to be there to report on the event. Bernays even put on the event. Everything was a machination. He paid out of the book. Paid the actors to be there, paid the news to be there, and the only people that weren't aware that this was a paid demonstration was an unsuspecting, unwitted public. So at the end of the rally, all of these beautiful starlets, they pull out their Lucky Strike cigarettes and they step in the middle of the street and they light up, blocking traffic, and they're smoking cigarettes, handheld high, so everyone can see them. And all of their, handsome male counterparts, they're like, oh, well, I can't stop this. There's too many hot babes in the street. And the journalists reported it as these women were lighting torches of freedom, like Lady Liberty herself, illuminating the way for future generations of feminists to carpe dick, seize the day, make your own phallus, be the man that everyone wanted you to be. And within 6 months, the metrics went from 6% of American women were smoking cigarettes to 60% were smoking cigarettes. And for his contribution to the great effort of more lung cancer, what he did was he got $50,000 from Lucky Strike cigarettes and the American Tobacco Corps. To put this in perspective, back then you could get an ounce of gold, a full troy ounce of gold, for around $22 to $24, which means that every $100 was actually 4 gold coins would be a fun way to conceptualize it. Each of those gold coins today carries a value of close to $3,000, right? So $100 back then is close to $1,200 now. So $1,000 back then was, you can extrapolate it out by a factor of 10, and you can then multiply that by a factor of 10, then multiply it by 5. You get a rough idea of how much the boy was actually making. It's lucrative, what he was doing. So afterwards, Mr. Bernays, he goes on for his next job, because you got to stay productive, right? You can't just sit on a couple mil. You need more. More is always the game. So there's a man named Jacobo Arbenz, who was elected as the democratically elected president of a small country to America's southern border called Guatemala. Now, Guatemala had this crazy thing going on where they thought that America owning all of their farmland was bad, especially since America wasn't paying fair prices for all of this farmland. They wanted to raise the tariffs, and all of the like cheap fruit and bananas and stuff that had been coming out of this country was suddenly put at jeopardy because of a new democratically elected president. So the question becomes, how do we fix this in a way that's not just invading Guatemala, which was right after World War II, probably what Americans would have been more keen to doing, honestly. So they hired Mr. Bernays. Now Bernays goes in and does, in my opinion, his most impressive job of psyops, military deception, and you could say it, propaganda that I've ever seen in a semi-modern setting. So what he did, and you might want to pay attention to this playbook. It's actually pretty cool. He hired a bunch of dumb Americans that have like a big following. People that really listen and hang on to every word, like their fan bases are rabid. Think a TikToker or a Twitch viewer, someone that doesn't do a ton of critical thinking. And if they do a ton of critical thinking, it's the controlled opposition narrative. What I mean by that is Edward Bernays does a really good job of utilizing a military deception tool that's existed since the Civil War. And this military deception tool is called Magruder's Principle. Now, Magruder's Principle is a very basic premise, which is basically the premise of the movie Inception. It's a great movie, especially if you're into the whole psyop stuff, but it is easier for a psyoper, a propagandist, a public relations guy, you name it, to get you to believe something if you already have a prejudice about the thing that we're trying to get you to believe. If you think that Toyotas are an indestructible brand and nothing on God's green earth is ever going to make that car unreliable, right? Well, as a Toyota salesperson, I know I can make shitty cars and still have people buy the next iteration. They may not buy it for long, but I can get you to already believe that preconceived concept. Versus I could be selling a Maserati, right? And the concept behind a Maserati is, oh, it's going to be very, very expensive. The maintenance is going to be really expensive. And in a couple years, if I don't keep up with it, it's going to be destroyed, jacked, ruined, whatever. If I know you own a Maserati and I know you think like that, well, then you'd be probably more willing to accept a lowball offer than somebody who thinks it's the best car in the whole world and yada, yada, yada. Likewise, if I know you have a prejudice towards a certain race, or if I know that you're cowardly, or if I know that you think that our military is the best at amphibious assaults, and then I make it seem like we're going to attack your country from the ocean, but in the real scheme of things, we're coming from the back, behind you, by night, through the desert, storming Norman Schwarzkopf in Iraq, right? That's another form of Magruder's Principle. If I know you have an inclination of how something might go, and I know that's how you think it'll go, I can play around that, right? By capturing you to your own prejudice. Also, let's say you grew up on an island like I did. And on that island, you never see other ethnic groups. It's just you and people that look like you. Well, it's really difficult for me to have the implantations of prejudice against another race if I've never seen that race or had any interaction with them. You're really only relying on fear. See what I mean? So Magruder's Principle, that's like one of the most key fulcrum and pivot points that we use for any sort of getting somebody to believe a narrative, right? During this period of American history, the Red Scare was just coming into fruition, and this idea that we would be fighting the communists for the end of time, essentially, was not a unreasonable circumstance. The Cold War, everybody felt like nuclear Armageddon was right around the corner, and both sides felt like they were losing until, the USSR eventually collapsed. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to Guatemala. Edward Bernays hired these TikTokers, these Twitch streamers, these dumb Americans to come down to this beautiful, beautiful resort in Guatemala. And on this resort, he gave them every version of entertainment that you could expect a billionaire to provide you on a private resort in a third world country. Essentially, all the booze, whores, drugs, gambling, you name it, they had it there on that resort. And so when they were on the resort, the Americans were just given very, very specific key pieces of information that they had to follow. The first one was, under no circumstance were you allowed to leave the compound. Because the moment that you left the compound, there'd be these dangerous Guatemalan communist groups that are outside just waiting to capture you and snip off your little American fingers and toesy woesies and sell them back to your fans and family for thousands of dollars so that they could fund the communist junta to overthrow Guatemala and institute a communist government. Well, okay, we won't leave the compound. And then things got way more interesting, right? So they're on the compound, and there's a man named Howard Hunt. Now, I really, really, really recommend that you look Mr. Howard Hunt up. Howard Hunt was involved in pretty much every single crazy, forlorn, sketchy, name one politically weird thing that we probably shouldn't have done in the 60s or 70s. Howard Hunt was involved with it. I guarantee it. He was involved in the Bay of Pigs. That's weird, right? He was one of the dudes caught working for Nixon as a plumber during the Watergate scandal. Weird. He was the CIA director of all things in Guatemala. Weird. He was a known associate of the casino mogul, crazy philanthropist, the inspiration for Dr. House in Fallout New Vegas. How he was known associates with Howard Hughes. I should just spit that out there. And Howard Hughes, I mean, that guy's got his own lore. You should look into him. Everything from aerospace engineer to 19-year-old savant. He was emancipated at 19 with millions of dollars to his name, and then went on to become one of the craziest mob bossy type casino deep state guys you've ever heard of in American politics. And he was super close with the other Howard Hunt and Howard Hughes, hanging out together all the time, right? And then those guys are involved together with Nixon, with the whole Watergate fiasco. There's a whole thing going on. At one point, Howard Hunt was hired to kill Howard Hughes by poisoning him to death through his aspirin bottle and coating his steering wheel full of LSD so that he'd have a panic attack on the road and die. But none of that ended up happening because Watergate happened the year before that, so they couldn't even pull the trigger to kill the other Howard. But I digress. That Howard Hunt, is in Guatemala with Edward Bernays running the whole show for the CIA, while Bernays is down there running this whole thing for United Fruit. So what Bernays does, similar to the Lucky Strike incident, he hires his own journalists. He hires his own photographers. He hires his own paid agitators, his own people protesting, and he has them all show up to the capital city of Guatemala, right next to this resort where all the Americans are there, able to watch and witness all of this. So to the Americans, they see thousands of Guatemalans in the street holding up signs. We hate communism. We hate communism. Go America. We want Jeffersonian democracies. Give us free elections. We want free speech. Very similar to other such events that have happened in American history. And you, as an American TikToker, probably one of the dumb ones, probably one of the ones that you think with your heart. You see all these people struggling in the street, and your cynical part of your brain doesn't go, what if this is a trick cooked up to manipulate my mind and turn me crazy and make me No, you think like a human being with the heart and soul and empathy. And you go, it's a fucking shame that all of these Guatemalans are down here protesting for a better world, And that brutal, oppressive regime is so anti-American, so anti-Jeffersonian ideals that we would sit here and do nothing and watch these poor people toil. Well, it's their fight, whatever. At least it's peaceful, yeah? And then, cue Mr. Howard Hunt. He flies overhead with a bunch of CIA guys in bomber planes, and they drop bombs near the protesters. Not intending to actually, like, kill or destroy stuff. But the premise was they wanted the Americans to think that these people were being targeted by their own government, when really it was our government targeting people that we hired. You know, our own paid opposition to be there. And so bombs are dropping near the Americans, and they're scared, and bombs are dropping near the protesters, and the protesters are running in panic. And these Americans are like, oh my God, we have to evacuate, get to the airfield. And as they're going to the airfield, there's bombs exploding, and they're all, oh my God, I'm about to die. I'm about to die in a Guatemalan terrorist attack. And they get on the plane, and they fly home, and they get home, and they tell everybody what happened. Dear God, there's communists in Guatemala, and we almost died, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And it didn't take long for there to be a cultural awakening against this communist regime, and money started pouring out of America to go fund these anti-communist insurgency groups, which, lo and behold, overthrew the government of Guatemala with some help from the CIA, and then instituted basically a banana republic to serve the U.S. government. So this journalist overthrew a country with a little bit of help from some CIA magic, right? Using nothing more than pyrotechnics, a couple airplanes, some paid actors, some storytelling, and getting just paid Americans to sell to their audience. Because they knew that they could never touch their fan base as well as the actual media influencer. These influencers will have more of an influence on their local subgroup than the government ever could instill that fear. You need this guy, this intermediary, to really bite the hook so that then when they sell, it's coming from a place of authenticity. It's way harder to tell a lie if you know it's a lie. When you think you're adamantly defending the truth, you might defend it with your last dying breath. And that just makes the other believers that much more of a believer that the lie was real. Anyways, Howard Hunt, Howard Hughes, Edward Bernays, Richard Nixon, right? Because during Watergate, Howard Hunt got arrested during Watergate, allegedly doing all of this for Richard Nixon, which is a whole nother kit and caboodle that we can talk about at another point. So there was a lot going on. There was a lot going on in that time period, and I think so much of it is really represented by this photograph, right? Now, we're not done. Let's make this history relevant, right? I've been telling you guys stuff that happened in the 70s and the 80s or whatever. Where does this impact you in your day-to-day life? What's some stuff that you could look at? Well, Edward Bernays, his lineage carries on today. And his nephew was Mark Randolph, the CEO and co-founder of Netflix. So the Freud family, the one that discovered you have a subconscious mind and then tried to pimp it out for war bonds, for we want you to come serve Uncle Sam's army. That same Freud family was also the Freud family that is the reason why women smoke cigarettes in this country, right? They are the same company that's willing to sell out your health and your body to these massive cigarette companies under the guise that they're making you more independent. They're selling you dreams at the cost of your health. Is the same family that also created Netflix, one of the world's largest media curation platforms. That's like a PsyOps artist's wet dream. Can you imagine how much power you have if you were the curator of the top 10 on Netflix? So there's a couple points, right? Like every country has different Netflix availabilities and curations. America's going to have different Netflix than Britain. Japan's going to have different Netflix than Korea. Germany's going to have a different Netflix than Canada. And every single one of these, you get to put the top 10 movies, the most popular movies. And in those top 10 movies, you get to pick which archetypes are being explained. What do we need people afraid of? Should we pump up the climate change movies? Should we make it more World War II stuff out there? Should we cycle through what media will get people to resonate more with where we want them to be in 10, 15, 20 years culturally? If I can show you, this is what everyone in your country likes to watch. They really love this. And in that movie, there's bad guys that display certain characteristics. Well, I can even show you the best way to deal with those bad guys culturally, can't I? Whatever that means to you, whatever country you're from, or whatever backdrop of the American zeitgeist you're looking at this from, it's a ton of power and a ton of control and a ton of influence for this one, product to have. When you know things like this, it makes way more sense that you start to see things like whenever there is rampant pedophilia allegations in the royal family, who comes running out of the darkness to buy the royal family story for $250 million? I can only speak for myself. I'm an American, right? But I've never felt inclined or any sort of inclination to watch the story of British monarchs. And maybe I'm alone in my assessment of this, but I have a hard time believing that Netflix would pay $250 million, $250 million for the royal family story, and then realistically expect that they'd ever make a return on that investment. To me, that seems way more like powerful old forces, economic forces, political forces, you name it, taking care of their allies behind the guise of an economic model. Well, I hope you found this little history lesson exciting or interesting, or maybe there's some things that I didn't quite get right and you want to correct me or teach me something in the comments. I'd really love to hear more. I'd really love to hear your side of whatever any of these topics are. Thank you so much, and if you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching my videos. You're a real one, and every minute that you watch, every like, every comment, all of that stuff really helps my algorithm out. So thanks so much, and I hope you tune in for the next one. Bye.